Advanced Health Sciences Psychology B, Virtual Interactive Notebook 5, Psychological Disorders. Day 1, what is a psychological disorder? It's going to get controversial. Your essential question is, what is a psychological disorder? The main idea is disorders. We have 2 subtopics. They are defined and culture. Today's reading comes from Chapter 15, Section 1. Okay, so what is a psychological disorder? Well, abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. I want you to write down for the definition, abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Let's think about that. Thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that aren't normal. Hang on, Mr. Medlock. Doesn't normal change? Yeah. So doesn't that mean that there is a cultural component to what a psychological disorder is? Yes. And that's where the controversy comes in. Now, here are the examples that your book gives. And I think this might change in the last couple months. All right. 1, your book says that people who hear demons have a psychological disorder. Now, for some religious people, that's not going to be the case. That will be real. I think probably for the majority of Americans, hearing demons is very likely a symptom of psychotic disorder. And a psychotic disorder is one in which you see, hear, smell, taste, touch things that aren't actually there. All right? But it's not going to be that way for everybody. But broadly, the culture seems to think that a person who hears demons needs psychological help. Now, your book also says a person who washes their hands 40 times a day has a psychological disorder because that's not normal. They might say that that person has OCD. But in an age of a pandemic, is that abnormal behavior now? Would that be a psychological disorder now? Well, according to the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, it's what all American healthcare professionals, and I think globally, it's the book they use to diagnose psychological disorders. If you look in there, then lots of hand washing can be a symptom of obsessive compulsive disorder. Right? But we're in a pandemic. Maybe the culture is going to change. So that's interesting. What I want you to have for that note is abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And for examples, I want you to actually write these down. Examples: hears demons, washes hands 40 times a day. All right. Now, for culture, the definition of abnormal varies by culture. So I want you to write that down for culture. The definition of abnormal varies by culture. I also want you to write culture bound. Psychological disorders can be bound by culture. For example, in Italy, there is a condition called an attacco nervioso or something like that, a nervous attack, that is a legitimate diagnosed psychological disorder. And the example that I've read about, and I've actually asked Italian and Spanish exchange students, and they say, this happens, is let's say a teacher in a class in Italy suddenly just loses it and goes on a verbal tirade, and there's profanity and stuff like that in there. Every kid I've had from Spain and Italy, they say, yeah, that happens sometimes. Now, that would get me fired, but for them, that can be symptoms of a mental health issue. The person was under too much stress, and that's how they expressed it. But we don't have that. In the United States, we would call that losing it. That person lost it. And what we mean is they were feeling a lot of anxiety and anger, and they just gave in, and they didn't control themselves, and they should accept consequences. But in Italy and Spain, well, it was a nervous attack, so okay. Maybe they need to spend some time at home or something like that and rest up. They're under too much strain. That's culture bound. Here's another example of possibly a culture-bound disorder. Through Willamette Promise, the organization that I do this through, we get frequent lectures. And there is a lecturer at Western Oregon University who says that dissociative identity disorder, which used to be known as multiple personality disorder, is culture-bound. People who aren't in Western cultures don't get it. Now, I don't know that that's true, and there have been a lot of people who've suffered from dissociative identity disorder, and it's a very controversial thing. But she said, nah, it's culture bound. It's not real. I don't know. know about that. Also, suicide seems to be much more a Western thing, is what she said. So suicide maybe could be culture bound. Like there are cultures where people just don't commit suicide. It does not happen, right? So it could be a problem specifically to Western culture. That second one, I'm pretty sure, because I'm remembering. Okay, let's take that second one with a little bit of suspicion. I'm 99% positive that she said it the way I did, but let's view everything. I mean, I view it with skepticism, right? And I view the dissociative identity disorder with skepticism, but I'm not a psychological professional, and she was. Anyway, I bring that up as an example. I don't want to argue about it or anything like that. And I think that people who display dissociative identity disorder are probably uncomfortable and suffering and need treatment. So I don't want anyone thinking otherwise. But there you go. All right. So the definition of abnormal varies by culture. Now, the examples that your book gives are really interesting. The one that I'm going to talk about is, if someone smiles at you and you don't smile back, in the United States, you're socially awkward. But in Japan, that's normal because people in Japan are more reserved. They would think that you just smiling at someone that you don't know maybe is kind of socially awkward. So it's exactly the opposite, right? So culture plays a heavy part in what we consider to be abnormal behavior. And finally, the great example, right? And I don't want to preach morality or anything like this. Right? It's just a really good example. So in 1973 and in 1987, the American Psychological Association decided to sort of downgrade homosexuality as a disorder in 1973. And in 1987, they removed it completely. So homosexuality went from a psychological disorder in the DSM to normal behavior, right? And that shows a change in the culture. Whether or not you agree with that, right? The definition of psychological disorder in that case changed, right? Okay, so for your output today, I want you to read the article. I say read this article about nervous attacks. Really, it's about how cultures express anxiety. People express anxiety differently in different cultures. So I want you to read that, follow the link and read that, and list all the ways that a culture might express anxiety. All right, thank you very much. See you tomorrow for day 2.